Hello and welcome everyone to another webinar series episode from Global Wonks as part of our now ongoing series around how COVID-19 will change the world, views from different regions and sectors. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, one of the key differentiators of our webinar series is that we aim it almost exclusively towards our users. Corporates and financial institutions on the one hand, and our experts on the other. And our goal is to have short, snappy 30-minute webinars with leaders from around the world who are advisors to Global Wonks as part of our network and partners more broadly to ensure that we're bringing you the best insights from around the world. And today I'm particularly excited to be joined by DJ Peterson, founder and president at Longview Global Advisors, who, among other things, is a senior advisor to Global Wonks and is on our advisory board. Prior to Longview Global Advisors, DJ's career has spanned over 30 years in which he has advised and counseled some of the leading decision makers across corporates and elsewhere. His career has spanned both academia, policy research, and political risk. Clients have often described DJ, and I can attest to this, having been in some of these meetings with him, as a thought partner, a knowledge coach, and an advisor on political risk and geopolitical and macro affairs writ large. From 2006 to 2012, DJ built and led the corporate advisory services practice at Eurasia Group, where he and his team advised executives of large cap companies in North America, Europe, and Japan. Prior to that, between 1998 and 2006, DJ was a political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he led major research ventures in areas such as technology futures, the environment, national security, and Eurasian affairs. And it's in specific regard to Eurasian, Eastern European, and Russian affairs that DJ wrote his doctoral dissertation and other work since. Today's session is really continuing this theme of bringing in speakers to Global Wonks' webinar series around really what's going to happen at a broader macro level. We've had some speakers that have spoken about this from a pure policy perspective. We've had speakers that have spoken about this from an organizational psychology perspective. And I'm delighted that DJ's background really spans a broad swath of issues and areas that hopefully he'll be tapping into today. And so with that said, DJ, over to you. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bilal, and great to be with everybody today. Like Bilal said, I'll be just speaking for a few minutes. What I wanted to do first is highlight some issues we're watching. As Bilal said, Longview Global Advisors is a thought partner and business intelligence provider to executives, specifically of large multinationals. And one of the things that we help them think through is just what are the big issues happening in the world and what should they be paying attention to. So I thought I would highlight just a few issues that we're following right now, we've been watching for 2020, and then we can talk a little bit about some methodological issues. Since the pandemic started, I think one of the biggest issues is this what we call a risk cascade, or the stacking up of multiple risks. So in the first quarter of this year, we saw the emergence of a health crisis around the world, obviously first and most acutely in China. And the health crisis has begat an economic crisis. And in many places in the world, the economic crisis is exacerbating or creating a social crisis, and perhaps ultimately a political crisis. So you have this risk cascade of health crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, and political crisis. And this is placing governments under tremendous strain. It looks like countries like China and Vietnam have been able to contain this issue as a health crisis and not really spill into a full-blown economic crisis. But you see tremendous economic stresses in Japan, for instance, and in much of Europe, and of course the United States. Social crises have been spinning out. You see as kind of a slow motion, or earlier on you saw an emergence of a social crisis in India, for instance, with the movement of people or getting stuck, mass migration back to villages. Brazil, tremendous social pressures right now, and of course the United States, a social crisis. And if you look at the interplay, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter movement and the epidemic, the pandemic, and the economic crisis, kind of the pandemic, unemployment, economic stress, really kind of exacerbating the social crisis around Black lives in the United States. And then finally giving way to a political crisis. And it was very interesting to watch the developments, for instance, in Belarus unfold. And a lot of people, I think it's really important we're focused on the election as the trigger for the demonstrations, but there was a lot of frustration about the very poor handling of the pandemic in Belarus by the regime and by the leadership, and almost mocking the seriousness of the pandemic. So you can see, I think Belarus might be one of the very first clear examples of a political crisis emerging from the health crisis. Clearly, the big question in the world is the United States. And will we have a full-blown political crisis? We're really on the edge of it right now, and we'll know around the time of the election. But the key point I want to make here is that the trends that have been set in place, or the developments that have been set in place by the pandemic, are going to be unfolding for years. The political crises, social crises might unfold, will be unfolding for years. Clearly what economists are telling us is that the economic effects, the economic crisis, is not going to be resolved in 2020. It's probably, in many sectors, not going to be resolved in 2021. And it's 2022, 23, where the world will be recovering economically. But what it will look like socially and politically is very difficult to predict. Second issue I wanted to highlight is the US election. And I think this word that we hear a lot in this pandemic, unprecedented, certainly applies to the United States. And so what does this mean for understanding the future of the United States, or even more broadly, what does it mean for understanding the future of the world, or making predictions, or trying to understand where things are going? One word you hear a lot about the United States is polarization. The Pew the Pew Research Center, a really well-respected polling agency, just came out with a survey recently, which said about almost 2/3 of Americans surveyed wanted to see significant change, structural change in the government. But they didn't say what kind of change. Is it authoritarian change? Maybe they want more authoritarian, but they want to continue the Trump agenda. So one, it's very important not to read one's own biases into data or things that we see, but also to kind of ask these broader questions about, well, what is the data telling us? And it's very difficult. Obviously, you've seen many predictions about what's going to happen in the election, of who's going to win, and how it's going to unfold. And I think one thing that's very important to look at is it's not necessarily who's going to win the election, but actually how is the election going to be decided? Obviously, you've heard a lot about issues around the ballot, but also, is it going to be something that's going to be in the courts, which is a very different kind of process? And then finally, what does the country look like the day after the election? One scenario I think that's very predictable is that one side or the other is going to be very unhappy with the results. And will there be mass protests? Will there be social unrest in the streets? And will this be unfolding? So one clear takeaway is that the election is not necessarily going to solve the United States political problem. It might exacerbate it. So this idea that one election outcome or the other might solve the United States problems or will avert a political crisis is not clear to me. Some other big, and I think these are kind of the big issues that businesses should be paying attention to. Some other issues that we're looking at clearly is what we're calling Cold War II, which is, it's not just China-US, it's really becoming a global effort to rebalance against China in many cases. Inequality in capitalism is another issue. Climate change is related to that. The future of Hong Kong, future of Taiwan, other big issues. The EU and Brexit. Techno-skepticism is another one. And then finally, we hear a lot of terms about globalization, protectionism, trade barriers. In some ways, what we're seeing, it's really about localism. It's really about trying to regain control of your country. And the issue is, oftentimes, it's not about us versus them, but the really way to think about it is sovereignty and having degrees of freedom, whether it's in your own household, or it's for your country. And some of these trends, all these issues that I just mentioned are in our outlooks, and you can find those at longviewglobal.com. But for sake of brevity, I'll stop there in the outlooks. But I want to just talk a few issues about the methodological challenges or analytical challenges, because these are really challenging times. I mentioned the word unprecedented. You think about the economic downturn in the second quarter in every country of the world was unprecedented. The depth of the global recession, the depth of the drop in trade, obviously so many aspects of the pandemic are unprecedented. But it really doesn't help to say that it's unprecedented. It's actually much more important to say, well, what's the significance? Where is it going? Or what does this mean? And so just saying unprecedented, I think is very unsatisfying analytically. The second big issue is dealing with a rapid pace of change. What we saw certainly again in the first and second quarters is rapid shutdowns of economies around the world and then rapid adjustments having to be made. And so I think this is really a huge analytical challenge. And what we've seen in these times, and it's been very important, is to use more high frequency data, flash analyses, flash polls, pulse surveys, data such as retail sales, tax revenues, airline travel, restaurant bookings, data that social scientists haven't used in the past, but this kind of rapid analysis. And I think actually this is where global wonks comes in really importantly. It's this able to get kind of a pulse survey, ask a number of experts very quickly, what are you seeing? What's your sense in a country or in a sector? So kind of the changing value of data. I mentioned multiple drivers at the beginning: pandemic, economic, social, political. Well, how do you untangle all of these? It's very challenging. If you're a political scientist, how do you talk about economics? Big issue that a lot of experts, certainly Longview, is being asked is to speak about pandemic-related issues, public health, medical research. And so to be able to talk about all these different issues, talk about, well, what's the future of the workplace? What is the future of various sectors in this rapid pace of change? So untangling all of these drivers that are in play right now is very challenging. A really good definition of historic, and people keep saying another key word we're saying, this is a historic moment, is an event is rare, and it is of large impact. And I think that's a really good definition of the challenge also. How do you talk about something that is rare, and how do you talk about something that has tremendous impacts? Again, if you think about the future of the United States and a political crisis in the United States, well, that's a huge event, and it has global implications, and it has analysts. How do we unpack this? And then also, how do we be objective and neutral about the future of the United States when it can have such huge implications for certainly other countries, the United States, but also economies. And then finally, again, as I mentioned, there is this huge demand for analysis, and it's also incumbent upon us to be very humble. We might know a lot about one domain, but we're asked to kind of talk about an adjacent domain. And we could get smart very quickly, but we also have to be humble and realize that we don't know so much. And again, these historic events and unprecedented times. So how much can we say? But in all of this, I think the demand for knowledge and insight is more crucial than ever. And to the extent that we can bring objective and frank analysis to our clients is very important. I'll stop there, Bilal.